Ready to unlock some economic secrets.
Ooh, yeah. Sounds good to me.
Today we're diving deep into how those brilliant, sometimes baffling economic minds think.
Right, let's get inside their heads.
We've got a bunch of economic texts to guide us, covering those core principles, big historical events, and the theories that have really changed the world.
Like a crash course, but more fun.
Way more fun.
Economics can be a little intimidating with all the charts and graphs,
It can be.
but really it's all about the choices we make every day.
Every day. Exactly. Even if you don't realize it, you're thinking economically.
And we're here to help you see those choices more clearly, make them with more confidence.
Absolutely. We're here to equip you, make you feel empowered.
I like that.
Our first stop, scarcity.
The heart of it all.
Right. The text basically jumps right into this whole idea of limited resources, unlimited wants, which sounds pretty relatable, right?
Doesn't it though? I mean, it's like we always want more.
Always.
It's like this constant tension, wanting more than we can have. And that tension, that's what drives all economic decisions.
Makes you think.
Think about it. Your time, it's limited.
So true.
You could be doing a million things right now, but you're choosing to listen to us.
And we're so glad you are.
Glad to have you. But that also means you're giving up doing other stuff. And that's where opportunity cost pops up.
Okay, so I get that opportunity cost is a big deal, but I always stumble over the definition. The text defines it as, and I'm quoting here, the cost of one option in terms of the next best option available.
Right. It can sound kind of jargony.
It can. Can you give me an example that makes it really click?
Okay, imagine you're debating, should I invest in that hot new tech stock?
Ooh, risky.
Or should I add to my retirement fund?
Safe and sound.
Those potential gains from that tech stock, that's the opportunity cost of putting that money in your retirement.
So it's what I'm missing out on by choosing the retirement fund.
Yeah, exactly. And on the flip side, the security of that retirement savings, that's the opportunity cost of chasing those big returns in the stock market. It's
Yeah.
all about weighing the trade-offs. What are you willing to give up?
Okay, I'm starting to see the light. So we've got scarcity forcing us to make choices. Each choice has an opportunity cost. It's like a constant balancing act, right?
Always juggling?
But it's not always a simple equation, is it?
It can get pretty complicated.
The source material also brings up things like externalities. It talks about wealth versus income, and even gets into some of those weird ways our brains work with anchoring bias and the paradox of choice.
Oh, yeah. That's where things get really interesting, like almost where economics meets psychology, right?
It does.
It does. I find that fascinating.
Okay, so let's unpack some of that. Externalities first. What are those exactly?
Basically, the unintended consequences, those ripple effects of our actions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine a company decides to build a big new factory. They're all focused on making stuff and turning a profit.
Right, makes sense.
But what about the impact on the neighborhood?
Oh, yeah.
What about all that extra traffic or maybe even pollution?
Not so great.
Those are negative externalities, those hidden costs that don't always factor into the company's decision, but that affect everyone.
So costs to society, not just to the company.
Yeah.
The cost of progress. Right.
Hmm.
Something to think about. Now, what about wealth versus income? I always get those two mixed up.
Happens all the time. Income is like the flow of money coming in, your salary, earnings from investments. It's money in motion. Wealth, on the other hand, that's the snapshot, the total value of everything you own, your savings, your property, investments, even that collection of, I don't know, vintage records you've been building for years.
So you could have a high income but low wealth if you spend everything you earn, right?
Exactly. It's like income's the river flowing and wealth is the reservoir storing up the water.
That's a great way to think about it. But
Yeah.
you mentioned psychology earlier. What about those, I don't know, those quirks in our brains when we're trying to make decisions?
Ah, yes. Behavioral economics. I love this stuff.
Me too.
So the text highlights a few key ideas. Anchoring bias, for example. It's like we tend to latch on to the first piece of information we see, even if it doesn't make sense, and let it totally influence us.
Like a first impression that sticks, even if it's wrong.
Exactly. Like imagine you see a sweater originally priced at $200, but now it's on sale for $80.
Score. You're way more likely to buy it, right?
Yeah.
Even if you wouldn't have even looked twice if it was always $80.
That's so true. I've totally fallen for that.
That initial price, it's like an anchor. It sets your perception of the value. Retailers know how our brains work.
Sneaky. And what about the paradox of choice? I know I've felt that one.
Oh, we all have. It's that overwhelmed feeling when you have way too many options. Like you're standing in the cereal aisle at the store, right?
A million boxes staring back at me.
Exactly. And suddenly, all that choice, it makes it harder to choose. Leads to indecision, anxiety, even buyer's remorse. It challenges that old idea that more choice is always better.
So our brains kind of short circuit when there are too many possibilities.
In a way, yeah. We go from wanting it all to just feeling stuck.
Interesting. But enough about our indecisive brains for now. Let's move on to the aims of economics, which the text outlines next.
Sounds good.
It highlights three main goals: using resources efficiently, distributing wealth fairly, and keeping society stable.
The big three, the things that economists are constantly trying to balance.
It's like a three-legged stool. You need all three legs for it to stand.
Great analogy. And the tricky part is finding that sweet spot in the middle where they all work together.
That sounds hard. Are these aims always in sync? Or do they sometimes clash?
That's where it gets really interesting, because sometimes pursuing one goal can actually work against another.
How so?
Well, think about trying to make everything perfectly equal economically. Sounds good on paper, right?
Yeah, fair for everyone.
But it could end up discouraging people from innovating and taking risks, which could actually hurt the economy overall.
Right. Less reward, less motivation.
Exactly. And if you focus too much on just growing the economy super fast, you could end up with more inequality if the benefits don't reach everyone.
So it's like a constant tug of war between these different goals. Which aim do you think is most important?
Ooh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
The one economists have been debating forever, I imagine.
Absolutely. But the text does point to another important distinction that can help us figure this all out. Positive versus normative economics.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So positive economics, that's about what is. It deals with objective facts. Think cause and effect, testable theories, the science of economics. Normative economics, that's about what ought to be. It's about values, judgments, opinions about how the economy should work, ideally.
Got it. So positive economics is like describing the world as it is, and normative economics is like saying how it should be.
Exactly. And the text has a perfect example. Remember Minister McGrath's statement about the latest unemployment figures? That's a positive statement. Based on data, we can check if it's true or not.
Right.
But when Mr. Johnson argues that the government should implement like this very specific policy to bring those numbers down,
Right.
that's a normative statement.
Yeah.
It comes from his beliefs about what policies are best, not just facts.
I see. And that's why it's so important to be able to tell the difference between facts and opinions, especially with all the economic news and policy debates flying around.
You got it. It's like learning to decode the language of economics.
The grammar of data and the rhetoric of opinions.
I like that, yeah. You got to be able to separate the objective analysis from the subjective viewpoints. It really is. You have to be able to spot those hidden agendas, you know?
Like learning to read between the lines.
Yeah. And speaking of data, the next section in our source material dives deep into how important it is.
It's a whole section called Understanding Economic Data.
It's all about getting that accurate information.
Right, gathering the facts.
Then you got to analyze it all rigorously, use it to test theories, and try to make predictions about what's coming.
It almost makes economics sound like a science.
It is, in a lot of ways. Economics uses the scientific method, observing patterns, coming up with hypotheses, testing them with data, then refining those hypotheses based on what you find.
So it's not just about making guesses. There's a real process.
Oh yeah, it's a whole system. And just like in any science, data is like the foundation.
The building blocks of economic understanding.
Exactly. The text actually mentions the CSO here in Ireland.
The Central Statistics Office.
Right. They're like the detectives of the Irish economy, always out there gathering information.
I like that. Economic detectives.
Everything from employment figures to how people are spending their money.
So they help us get a sense of what's going on, the big picture.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, data can be tricky.
How so?
It can be manipulated.
Oh, you mean like twisted to fit a narrative?
Yeah, presented in a way that skews things, makes you see it differently than it really is.
Like that saying, there are three kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics.
That's the one. That's why you got to be careful.
Be skeptical.
Exactly. The text actually gives a great example of this.
What's that?
Manipulating the axis on a chart to make a trend seem way more dramatic than it really is.
I've seen that before. It's like they zoom in on just a small part of the graph to make it look like there's a huge change when really it's not that big of a deal.
Exactly. So you always have to look close.
Be a critical consumer of information.
Yes. Look beyond just the headlines and actually understand the data.
So, to recap, we've talked about scarcity, opportunity cost, those quirks in how our brains make decisions, the aims of economics, and the importance of data.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But how does this all play out in the real world? Like, what are the actual events that have shaped our economic landscape?
Great question. That's where the historical perspective comes in. The source material takes us on this whirlwind tour of key economic events that have really made the world what it is today.
Like an economic history crash course.
Exactly. And it starts with a big one, the Great Depression.
Oof, that was a rough one.
It was a global disaster, started in 1929, lasted for an entire decade. The text talks about Black Tuesday.
The day the stock market crashed.
Yeah. People panicked, sold everything they had for practically nothing. It really felt like the end of the world.
It must have been terrifying.
It was. Mass unemployment, banks failing left and right, widespread poverty.
Wow.
The text highlights how the Great Depression made everyone rethink economic theories and policies. It's what led to Keynesian economics becoming so popular.
The idea that the government needs to step in and do something to help the economy.
Right, like increasing spending and creating jobs.
And speaking of intervention, the source material also talks about a period closer to home.
A bit closer.
The Irish economic crisis of the 1950s.
Yeah. It was tough. Often called Ireland's lost decade, it was a decade of stagnation, really high unemployment.
And people leaving the country to try and find work elsewhere.
Mass immigration. The text paints this really powerful picture of what it was like. Families torn apart, hopes and dreams shattered. A whole country gripped by this feeling of hopelessness.
It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, it was rough. It's a real reminder that economic hardship affects real people. It's not just numbers on a page.
Then, in a major plot twist, we have the Celtic Tiger. It's crazy to think that just a few decades after that lost decade, Ireland experienced this time of really rapid economic growth.
It is a pretty remarkable turnaround.
Like night and day.
Foreign investment, low taxes for corporations, EU membership, all these things came together, and suddenly Ireland's economy was booming throughout the 90s and early 2000s. The text talks about how fast everything was changing, construction everywhere, tons of new businesses popping up. It was a time of optimism, real possibility in the air.
Like Ireland finally caught a break.
Yeah. But of course, even the Celtic Tiger had some downsides. The text mentions rising inequality, a housing bubble that eventually burst, and all the environmental costs of such rapid growth.
So a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked growth, even when it seems good.
Exactly. And then, of course, the Great Recession of 2007, a global financial crisis set off by the collapse of the housing market in the U.S. Remember how it felt like the whole world was falling apart?
Like dominoes.
Yeah. The text points out how interconnected the global economy had become by that point. A subprime mortgage crisis in the U.S., and suddenly the whole world is feeling the effects. Banks failing, stock markets crashing, unemployment skyrocketing everywhere.
So a truly global crisis.
And Ireland was hit especially hard because of how dependent it had become on construction and that property boom that fueled the Celtic Tiger.
So from boom to bust, like riding a roller coaster.
Up and down. But through it all, people have been developing and refining economic theories, trying to make sense of it all. The text introduces us to some of the big names, the thinkers who've shaped how we understand economies. It's like a hall of fame of economic thought.
Ooh, I like that. A Hall of Famer. Let's meet these economic giants.
Okay, so we've got Adam Smith, often considered the father of modern economics.
The OG.
Published his book, The Wealth of Nations, back in 1776. It laid the groundwork for free market capitalism, the idea that individuals pursuing their own self-interest in a free market would actually end up benefiting society as a whole.
The invisible hand of the market.
Exactly. It's a powerful idea, super influential, but, is it always true? I mean, sometimes doesn't that self-interest lead to some pretty bad stuff?
Like exploiting workers or harming the environment.
Good points. Smith's theories have been both praised and criticized over the years, and that's what I love about economics. It's an ongoing conversation, always evolving.
I like that.
Then we have Thomas Malthus, a bit of a downer, who was really worried about overpopulation.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about him.
He argued that population would grow faster than our ability to produce food, leading to famine and all sorts of misery.
That's a pretty dark prediction.
It is. Luckily, we've made some big advancements in agriculture since then.
So we've managed to avoid a Malthusian catastrophe so far.
Oh, far, yeah. But the concerns about scarcity, limited resources, and taking care of the planet, those are definitely still relevant today.
More relevant than ever.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, David Ricardo. He's the one who came up with the theory of comparative advantage. Basically, it explains why it makes sense for countries to specialize in producing certain goods or services that they're good at making.
Like, focus on their strengths.
Yeah, and then trade with each other, leads to greater efficiency and benefits everybody.
So it's like the economic argument for globalization.
Exactly. But like any theory, it has its critics.
Right. They're always different perspectives.
Some argue that it overlooks things like worker exploitation and environmental damage that can come with global trade.
Right. The downsides. Okay. Who's next in our Hall of Fame?
Okay, now we get to Karl Marx. He's probably sparked more debate than any other economist. His critique of capitalism, his analysis of class struggle, it really had a huge impact on economic thought and even political movements.
Yeah, his ideas about workers being exploited, the inherent contradictions of capitalism, they've resonated with a lot of people.
They have. But his solution, communism, hasn't really worked out that well in practice, has it?
Not really. Those historical experiments with communism have often been a bit messy, haven't they?
A bit messy is putting it lightly. They've been tied to authoritarianism, economies that don't work, and human rights abuses.
Not great.
Not great at all, but his ideas are still really important. They force us to think critically about the relationship between capital, labor, and power.
Could question the status quo.
Exactly. Okay, moving on to the 20th century, we have John Maynard Keynes, another huge name in economics.
Big kahuna.
He's the one who argued that the government should step in and manage the economy, especially during tough times like recessions or depressions.
Keynesian economics, right.
Exactly. He emphasized the importance of government spending and fiscal policy to stimulate demand, create jobs, and get the economy moving again.
And his ideas became super influential, especially after the Great Depression.
They did. They've shaped economic policy in a lot of ways ever since. But just like with any theory, there are people who disagree. Like Milton Friedman.
Oh, yeah, he was a big believer in free markets.
Huge. He was all about controlling the money supply to manage inflation and keep the economy stable. He thought the government shouldn't interfere too much, that the free market was better at allocating resources and creating economic growth.
Less government, more free market.
Exactly. And his ideas gained a lot of traction in the 70s and 80s, and they're still pretty influential today. And then there's supply-side economics, which is all about cutting taxes and regulations to incentivize businesses to invest, create jobs, and boost the economy.
The idea that if businesses have more money, they'll create more jobs and everyone will benefit.
That's the gist of it. It got really popular in the 80s under President Reagan in the U.S., and it's still a big part of economic discussions today.
It's amazing to see how these different theories have actually shaped real-world policy decisions and influenced history.
It's really fascinating to see how it all connects.
It is like a giant puzzle, all these different pieces fitting together.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's no one right answer in economics, It's about understanding those different viewpoints, what works and what doesn't with each theory, and then how you can apply that to the problems we're facing right now.
So it's less about finding a magic formula and more about being flexible.
Exactly. Economics is about tackling tough questions.
Weighing the trade-offs.
Using the best information you have to make smart decisions, not just for yourself, but for everyone.
Right, thinking about the big picture. So as we wrap up our deep dive into economics, what are the big takeaways? What do you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, first, I hope they realize that economics is everywhere. It's not just this abstract thing,
Not just something you read about in textbooks.
Right. It's about the choices we make every single day, how we spend our time, our money, even our energy. It's all economics.
And those choices, they're always shaped by that tension between wanting more and having limited resources.
Scarcity, the core of it all.
Understanding that, how scarcity drives everything, I think that can help us make better choices.
Absolutely. Being more intentional about how we use our resources.
We also looked at the goals of economics.
Yeah.
Efficiency, equity, stability.
The big three.
And how sometimes they can actually work against each other. Finding that balance, that's an ongoing challenge.
It is. It's always evolving.
Yeah.
And then there's data. It's super important for understanding how economies work, but you got to be careful with it.
Like you were saying earlier, it can be manipulated.
Yeah. It's not always objective. You have to be a critical consumer, look for those hidden agendas, question how the data is being presented.
He's skeptical.
Be skeptical, exactly. It's like being a detective looking for those clues that reveal the bigger picture.
I like that. Data detectives.
Uh-huh. So we went through the history of economic thought, met some of the most influential thinkers, looked at their ideas, from Adam Smith's invisible hand to Keynes' call for government intervention. Understanding those different viewpoints can help you understand the economic landscape we're all navigating today.
Like having all the different tools in your toolbox. You just got to know which one to use when.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the basic principles to the historical events that have shaped our world. Hopefully, our listeners are feeling a little more prepared to tackle those economic complexities out there.
And remember, the text makes it clear, even though we can learn from past crises, there will always be new challenges.
That's always changing.
That's the thing about economics. It's dynamic, always adapting to the times.
So in a way, our learning never really ends.
It doesn't. It's a journey of continuous learning, asking new questions, looking for solutions to those emerging problems.
It's like we've given you a taste of the buffet. Now it's time to go explore all the delicious dishes on your own. But before we sign off, one last question for you, dear listener. The text pointed out some key lessons from those past economic crises. Things like making sure your government's finances are in order, managing debt responsibly, and focusing on those export markets for growth. But what do you think is the biggest economic challenge we're facing right now? Something to chew on as you continue exploring the fascinating world of economics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Keep those economic gears turning.
And stay curious out there.